We open with my favorite caveat. If I look exhausted, it's because I am exhausted. Shout out to everyone who's been watching this channel since 2015. You'll recognize that phrase. And for those of you who have been watching my channel for a long time, you might be surprised that this video opens with the declaration, ideology is not an entirely negative influence on people's lives. One of the most positive effects of ideology is that it provokes people into thinking through their own ideas in a coherent way, to think about the consequences of their ideas for society as a whole, scaling it up, moving beyond their own narrow and isolated self-interest. I think one really positive example of this right now is the effect that discussions surrounding transgender political ideology are having for individual transgender people. Now, if you've known a couple of transgender people in your life, you've probably known at least one who said to you at some point, look, for them personally, this isn't a political movement. You've probably met at some point a transgender person who took you aside and said, look, for them it isn't a philosophy, it isn't an ideology, it's not a political party they want to join up to, this is just what they do on the weekends, this is just what they enjoy sexually in their private life, or this is the nightclub they choose to go to, and for them, that is it. Well, there's something kind of isolated and narrowly self-serving about that, in contrast to engaging with a political ideology that challenges you to ask yourself the question, what kind of society are we building? When we move beyond tolerance, when we move beyond, removing short-term simplistic obstacles, like is it possible or impossible for a transgender person to be a school teacher, to be a university professor? Those are real questions in almost every society on Earth in the 21st century. When we move beyond those narrow, simple problem-solving challenges, where are we going with this? Thinking about that ideologically, I think it really is a kind of positive stimulus for people to reflect on who they are, on their desires, and on the implications of their desires for other people, for society as a whole, ethically, what it is you're trying to do. So ideology is not an entirely negative thing. It's not just something we should lament for the dangers it prevents in 21st century society. With that having been said, one of the problems with the ideologically charged nature of debate on the internet is that some things get discussed and debated as ideology when that is not truly what they are. The capitalist system is not an ideology. And I openly say, for example, that I am anti-communist, that I utterly despise quote-unquote anti-capitalism. I'm even pretty harsh on socialism. If you've watched this channel, socialism as a concept in its historical context. Communism is an ideology, and it's very easy for people to slip into the mentality of saying that therefore they oppose capitalism as a counterposing and alternate ideology. But when you really get down to it, what you're talking about with capitalism is a set of social norms and practices that emerged out of the collapse of feudalism and emerged independently in, for example, Japan and Holland, now the Netherlands, emerged independently in different political, social, and cultural conditions all over the world, and it was not guided by an ideology. It was not guided by a utopian vision. Okay? The single greatest transforming force in human history was the Industrial Revolution. Okay? The Industrial Revolution was never a utopian project. It was never an ideology. The scientific breakthroughs that took place in what's now called the Scottish Enlightenment, so really the discovery of electromagnetism, even the discovery of the modern toilet, and then deploying, for the first time, whole cities for the first time having sewage and running water deployed to them. Huge transformations in modern life that we now take for granted. Many of these things came about with no ideology whatsoever. Likewise, if you look at the historical development of the stock market was not created for any ideological purpose. It didn't result from some grand scheme of what society ought to be or what have you. And interestingly, the stock market had completely separate origins in Japan and in the Netherlands. It's a very specific example of what's now a crucial aspect of capitalism as we understand it, okay? The development of the banking industry in Europe is unique because in Europe they had this religion you may have never heard of called Christianity, and that made banking illegal. So again, the conditions that shape the emergence of capitalism, the breakdown of feudalism, the breakdown of the hegemony of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, the breakdown of the control of European Christianity that prevented banking as we know it, this wasn't an ideology, it wasn't a grand plan, it wasn't a utopian vision. Even the transformation of the meaning of property, this is one of the least documented and least understood issues in the genesis of capitalism. The fact that words in French like immobilier, it used to truly mean immobilier. There used to be unbelievable restrictions on property. The transformation of the system of monopolies into free enterprise. Of course, the end of slavery. Piece by piece, the components of capitalism came together. I can't even call it like a bird's nest. I mean, what we now refer to as capitalism is a set of best practices that largely emerged from the failure of other practices with no guiding ideology, with no utopian strategy, with no grand design. Now, likewise, today, what most of us live in is a mixed economy. And of course, we say mixed because we mean a mix of free market and centrally provided, taxpayer-funded government services, the private sector and the public sector, in other words. All of those compromises likewise emerge in a completely unplanned and spontaneous way, right? And again, you can look at the history of each country, and it's a different story, but of course, in some ways, it's kind of sort of the same story. I mean, the United States has this narrative about the Great Depression. Well, sorry, you can't actually start there. The Progressive Era in the 1890s, and then the Great Depression, and then World War II, unionization, and workers' rights, and minimum wage, all these things emerging. Well, you know, guess what? If you study the history of Holland and the history of Japan, it's a different history that produced fundamentally similar compromises. And thus, there's a kind of homogeneity to capitalism globally now, even though normally when you're looking at what we describe as capitalism in any one place, it's emerged from different circumstances in a very strange, staggering, unplanned way. It's also worth noting that the exceptions to the rule are by and large less successful than the places where it emerged unplanned and, if you like, organically or spontaneously. So, you know, Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism, which is recent history, so we're really talking about after 1991, varies a little bit from place to place what you're talking about. Those are places where capitalism was constructed more consciously and intentionally. Nobody today looks at the Ukraine as a positive example of what capitalism ought to be. I hate to do this to you guys. I hate to do this to you. Nobody looks at Hungary as a positive example. Nobody looks at the former Yugoslavia as a positive example. Now, admittedly, there's some bias involved there. But if you believe that ideological chalkboard planning of capitalism is a huge advantage, then we should be able to look at these relatively recent, relatively artificial, consciously, intentionally planned capitalist economies, and we should see much greater success than the places where capitalism emerged in a zigzag, messy, unplanned way. And by the way, guys, if you know anything about the history of Hong Kong and Singapore, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised just how messy and unplanned the emergence of capitalism there. Another great case study, Israel. The emergence of capitalism in Israel. It's a very short history, and, you know, the success of Israel as a free market economy. Another fascinating, bizarre case study. All right. So I end here my lengthy preamble about the fact that capitalism cannot be understood as something created by the Capitalist Manifesto. All right. Communism has the Communist Manifesto, and capitalism does not have a Capitalist Manifesto. All right. What capitalism has is a set of lessons learned from the drawbacks and ultimately the collapse of feudalism. In Europe, it was European feudalism. In Japan, it was Japanese feudalism. And, I think it's really worthwhile to say to yourself, hey, look, you know what? When you're talking about Malaysia, it's a completely different story of how we've ended up with capitalism. And that's why, in some ways, capitalism in Malaysia has not been successful in the same way that it was in some other cultural contexts. They never got the Capitalist Manifesto. They never tried to live up to a set of check marks. Okay, so probably this preamble could be a perfectly good standalone video in itself. But this is not why I turned on the camera today. This isn't the message I came to deliver to you. Some people, knowing that I am in this way a defender of capitalism against communism, and maybe more importantly, that I defend capitalism against so-called anti-capitalism, the stupidest ideology of them all, they're surprised when I say, in a frank, honest, down-to-earth way, that capitalism has serious disadvantages, that capitalism has serious drawbacks, okay? Now, why would I be reluctant to say that? It's just ridiculous. Refrigerators have serious drawbacks. I own a refrigerator right now. Technologically, I don't have anything better to replace it with. But you know what? For one thing, refrigerators are noisy. I don't want to have a refrigerator in the same room I sleep in. They use a lot of electricity. I mean, they take up a lot of space. They're incredibly heavy. We can start listing all the ways in which a refrigerator is less than optimal, and yet it's something right now we're all making our compromise with until somebody can come up with something better. So there's absolutely no reason to, be mousy or apologetic in bluntly and directly talking about the drawbacks and disadvantages of capitalism. For me, the number one issue that nobody wants to talk about on the left or the right with capitalism is actually the depopulation of rural areas, or to put it in more universal terms, the increasingly unequal distribution of your population geographically. So under feudalism, you had a system that was very, very good at keeping the population fixed to a plot of land. To some extent, even tribalism does this much more effectively than capitalism. It distributes the population and then, communicates to people powerfully, this is your land, you're bound to it, this is your responsibility. So, if you're talking about distributing human beings along a frontier or even along a highway or along a river, you could pass many centuries in a feudal system with your population distributed this way. As soon as feudalism starts decaying and starts being replaced by capitalism piece by piece, and again, there's this different history in France, in Germany, in England, and Japan. Part of the dynamism of capitalism is that people abandon the countryside and start moving to the cities. They start moving to the places where the greatest opportunities, generally the greatest risk, as well as the greatest rewards. And they even do this when there is not yet any technology that offers them the type of rewards we now associate with urbanization. They even do this when moving to the city means that you're risking death by cholera or death by malaria, depending on which climate we're talking about, when really your quality of life and health get much, much worse. So the crowding of people into cities, now in the 21st century, you look at a map of Japan. I'll tell this in a more human and tangible way. I met at my university in Canada a team of people doing research on this in rural Japan. They were visiting my university in Canada. They were talking about the fact that basically all of Japan has these villages and small towns where now the only people are elderly retired people, and occasionally the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of those elderly retired people who are left there with the elderly people while the parents are working in Tokyo, while the parents are working in a big city, and the parents come to visit once every 2 weeks or something, but the kid gets to grow up in the countryside. And those few kids light up the lives of these elderly people who otherwise live in a ghost town that is nothing but elderly people. Because everyone who's of working age has abandoned the town. Everyone who's even of university age has abandoned the town to pursue education and opportunity in the big city. Now, this is a profound problem with capitalism, and I wouldn't claim that there is no solution for it. The problem is that almost nobody is even talking about a solution. In a country like Canada, the more urban property prices go up, the more money the government makes out of those properties. The government makes money out of every new apartment and condominium and house that gets sold in Vancouver and Toronto. As each property goes up above $1 million, the government is making more and more money. They have a vested interest in fueling the property speculation and real estate development cycle. And seemingly the whole public is happy to participate in this ludicrous and self-destructive process whereby the countryside and smaller towns all get emptied out and hollowed out, and everyone starts living in just a couple of cities, a couple of big cities, where, again, kind of greatest risk and greatest reward. People are no longer afraid of cholera, but they move to a city where more than 50% of their income is being spent on their rent. And of course, the only other way of coping is to commute huge distances to get back and forth from these overpriced cities. There is basically no capitalist country in the world today that is sincerely interested in decimating the property value. And that was proved in 2008, right? There's no government that's going to be elected in New York City and say, you know what we need to do? The government needs to completely sabotage the value of condominiums and apartments. We need rent to fall by like 5 to 1, and we need the sale prices of houses and apartments to fall by 10 to 1, and we're going to make it happen. Okay, no, governments can make that happen. The problem can be solved. And I don't even mean rent control. I mean, there's a pretty simple toolbox the government has. The problem is, okay, it's partly just a free market phenomenon. This, again, is already kind of evident in the Renaissance. It's already evident for centuries. In some countries, it's accelerating in the 21st century, but in any case, it's still a profound problem. But it's a tendency that governments now are not checking or deterring. If anything, governments are part and parcel of this problem that's inherent in or emerges from market forces. Okay? Now, point 2 is that there is absolutely no natural relationship between education and employment under capitalism, okay? Now, believe me, I'm not suggesting to you that education was better under feudalism, and I'm not suggesting it was better under communism or socialism. I'm not. But we live in a world where people, as students, as teenagers, are expected to make a speculative decision with tens of thousands of dollars of their own money and with many years of their lives to choose a university or choose a college, or even choose a technical training program for some skill, some craft, some art. They're supposed to make that bet on the assumption that there will be demand for them to do that job, that they'll be paid a good wage, that they'll earn a good living doing it. And very often they are wrong. Conversely, the most popular areas of education, in Canada, being a school teacher, in Canada, being a history major, you have a situation where academia produces 100 times more people than could possibly be needed or wanted in that sector. One that I actually formally enrolled in and then decided not to do the course. You know, even in Canada, being a paramedic, it's massively over-enrolled. I wonder if that's because people watched reality TV in the 1990s. Like, people used to watch these TV shows that showed paramedics. But a lot of people want to be a paramedic. They like the idea of working in the back of an ambulance, even though it's very low paid. They like the idea of driving the ambulance or whatever. And I forget at the time, it was something like 10 to 1. But I forget if it was 10 to 1 or 51. But Canada was producing far too many paramedics, and there really were not jobs for all of them, and also they were being underpaid. So we have a situation where there is no relationship between free market mechanisms, the economy, whatever you want to say, capitalism as such, and the mix of free market and government involvement in the provision of education. Now, the other fundamental absurdity, which combines with both of these first two problems in a dynamic way, is rent itself. Pretty much any textbook will tell you rent is irrational in terms of the logic of capitalism. And of course, rent shapes everything we do. It shapes my life right now. I'm living here right now, partly because rent is cheap. If you have two businesses that are competing, there are two shops that are both selling falafels, okay? One falafel shop makes better falafels, and they innovate more, and they have a greater selection of products. And they have a smoothie machine. They sell drinks and vegetable juices. They're really great. And there's another falafel shop where the owner is lazy. He only makes 3 kinds of falafels. He doesn't care. There's no innovation, no smoothies. And let's also just say it's kind of dismal. He doesn't make an effort to make it a nice place to sit. Guess who's going to win in free market competition? The person who pays less rent. All free market competition is unfair on an irrational basis because the guy who owns the lousy falafel shop, if his grandfather owns the property and his grandfather is charging him rent, or his grandfather may let him run the business for free, but let's say his grandfather just says, hey, look, you know what? You and I were blood. I'm going to charge you a really low rent for this reason. Happens. Very common. And the other person is renting from a complete stranger at market rates. Maybe they're even getting ripped off. They have a really mean landlord who's charging them the absolute maximum. Guess who is going to win and guess who is going to lose in terms of free market competition? And there's no counter argument to this. And it infests every part of our lives. The amount you're going to spend on rent, in most cases, is going to be more than the cost of tuition. I mean, I looked at going to university in Tokyo. Tuition was a lot. But the cost of living in Tokyo, if I wanted to do university there, is so astronomical. I looked at doing university in Hong Kong in a totally different field. I have looked at a college program once where it was in Manhattan, New York, New York. You can be spending so much money on rent that it completely dwarfs, it completely obliterates the significance of tuition costs for education, right? And then the cost of rent, again, it's part of this bizarre, invidious cycle of capitalism hollowing out and abandoning the countryside, abandoning the frontiers, abandoning the majority of every country on earth, from Japan to Canada to the United States, and leaving us with this remnant of overcrowded, overpriced big cities where all of the cultural and economic life is almost forced to transpire, even past the point of diminishing returns, even to the point of economic irrationality, where people are spending the majority of their income just on rent, which is, again, by textbook definition, something that is economically irrational. In Tokyo today, the people who pay rent are poor, and the people who don't pay rent, for example, because they inherited an apartment that their grandfather owned, they're rich. You can have two people who have exactly the same job, two people who both work as an accountant in Tokyo, but one of them pays rent, and you have another one who might live in the same apartment building, but they don't pay rent because they inherited that apartment from their grandfather. One of them is rich, one of them is poor, doing exactly the same job at exactly the same level of productivity, making the same contribution to society. So these are my big, simple complaints about what is wrong with capitalism. And from my perspective, the tragedy is that these problems can be solved. And I think that, like with education, who's motivated to solve the problem? Who's even motivated to ask these questions? Who's motivated to even experiment with coming up with new solutions? Who's motivated to take risks and then be honest about which solutions worked and which ones didn't? The future of capitalism, again, this comes back to my major premise. There is no ideology. There is no utopia. There is no destination it's moving towards. There is no capitalist manifesto. And whether you find that inspirational or depressing, you have to admit to yourself there is no one destination that unites the fate of Japan, of Canada, of the United States. When I took a long train journey around France recently, so when I visit my daughter, I end up taking the train in a crazy zigzag pattern across France. I was shocked, genuinely shocked, to see that these same factors, the same hollowing out phenomenon, the abandonment of the countryside, was happening in France to the same extent, or maybe it was even worse in France than in Canada or Japan. And I like to read. I started reading articles about it. I was reading in English, not in French, but I found a lot of magazine articles, a lot of newspaper articles discussing this phenomenon and the struggle of governments, and in some cases charities, to try to prevent the abandonment of the French countryside. How can we do this? What are the methods to actually tackle the problem? The problems with capitalism don't come from any one source, from any one cause, and they're not tending toward any one destination. And it's for that reason that we need to be willing to experiment with many different solutions, and we need to be willing to learn from many different failures. Never forget, an experiment, by definition, is something undertaken with the outcome being unknown. Social experiments, political experiments, are ideas that we have to test without knowing what the outcome may be.